This is Story Recapped. Today, I'm going to explain a mystery sci-fi thriller film called 400 Days. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. An astronaut named Theo Cooper wakes up in a jail after being arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct the previous night. Upon his release, his supervisor, Walter Anderson, tells Theo that the board would have discharged him if it weren't too late to find someone to replace him on their next mission. Theo can't even go home to clean up because Walter immediately takes Theo to a press conference. When the press conference begins, Walter informs the journalists that the mission is an experiment to test the psychological effects of deep space travel in preparation for future manned missions. Kepler, the company behind the operation, aims to determine how astronauts will react to unforeseen challenges during the simulated space travel. The astronauts will be confined to a ship situated underground to make the simulation more realistic. When a journalist asks about the astronauts' concerns, Dr. Emily McTeer notes that there is a danger that the astronauts could perceive reality differently due to their isolation. Walter then introduces Cole Dvorak, an engineer who has also been assigned to create weekly videos to keep the public updated about the simulation. Bug Kozlowski, who is in charge of the ship's life systems, tells the journalist that he will be conducting his own scientific experiments throughout the mission. When a reporter asks Theo, the mission's captain, if he'd like to say something about the simulation, he says he has nothing to add because he's suffering from a hangover and his girlfriend just broke up with him. Walter ends the press conference by noting that the mission has a few curveballs in store for the astronauts. During the photo op, Walter whispers to Emily to remind her of their deal. Before sending the astronauts underground, Walter tells them that he'll end their careers if any of them quits early. The astronauts enter the underground ship one by one soon after Walter opens the hatch. Theo takes one last look at the trees and the hills before going inside. Afterward, the astronauts put on their spacesuits and perform a systems check to prepare for the simulated launch. Moments after the countdown, the computer warns the team that the payload is still attached to the ship. Walter notes the ship will disintegrate if they fail to drop it, so Theo takes a few seconds to think before telling the team to adjust the ship's trajectory. The payload detaches from the ship soon after they make the necessary adjustments. Walter congratulates the team for passing their first test and informs them that he left gifts in their bunkers. Bug finds a notebook to write down his thoughts, while Cole gets several adult-oriented magazines. Emily gets a few origami papers, and Theo gets 3 decks of playing cards. Later on, Theo stops by the clinic for a routine mental health checkup. Emily asks Theo about his current mood, so Theo confesses that he's depressed, angry, and confused. When she inquires why he feels that way, Theo gets exasperated and tells her not to play games with him. Emily points out that it's part of the questionnaire, so Theo tells her that the woman he wanted to marry turned him down and broke up with him. Emily notes that their situation is complicated, but she fails to explain why she suddenly ended their relationship. As they're about to have dinner, Emily prepares to inject the team with vaccines. Cole raises his objections, but Emily warns him that they're more susceptible to viruses because they're in close quarters. Cole eventually agrees when Theo and Bug tease him about being afraid of a shot. The first week soon passes without any problems. On day 26, the crew suddenly hears an explosion immediately followed by a strong quake. Emily surmises that it's part of the simulation, so she remarks that they must be passing through an asteroid belt. Bug points out that the only asteroid belt of significance is beyond Mars. The team attempts to contact Mission Control, but no one responds. Not long, the computer warns them that the ship is recalibrating its solar power storage. Cole examines the batteries and finds nothing wrong with them, so he concludes that the solar panels must have been damaged. Theo notes that it must be one of the mission's curveballs, so he urges the team to conserve power. A few days after, Emily tries to contact Walter without consulting the team. Emily gets startled when Theo approaches her and asks what she's doing. Emily notes that she's just trying to contact Mission Control. There's still no response, so Emily deduces that the lack of communication must be part of the simulation. As Emily is about to return to her room, Theo wishes her a happy birthday. When Emily leaves, Theo recalls spending time with her in bed days before the mission. Emily asks him if they had made a mistake getting into a relationship, and Theo responds that he didn't care. Cole starts becoming irritable as more time passes. After 200 days, Emily injects the team with vaccines again. When Cole uploads his videos to the computer, he hallucinates and sees a text suggesting that Emily is poisoning him. On day 218, Bug catches a mouse in his lab and shows it to the team. Cole tells Bug to get rid of it because it's unsanitary, but Bug contends that it's part of the crew. Cole then takes the mouse from Bug and steps on it. When Cole and Bug start yelling at each other, Theo tries to mediate, but Cole turns his attention to Theo and shoves him against the wall. The two men exchange blows until Emily stops them. When Cole checks himself for bruises in his room, he hallucinates and sees blood dripping from his nose and face. After realizing that it was only in his mind, Cole stops by the infirmary to tell Emily about it. Emily tells Cole that he's probably dehydrated, so she advises him to take better care of himself. Emily then points out that Cole has never spoken about his family throughout their mission. She notes that the mission would be easier on him if he had friends, family, or other kinds of connections. Cole discloses that he wasn't close with his family because his parents sent him to boarding school when he was 8 and stopped visiting when he was 11. Cole tries flirting with Emily, but she rejects his advances, so he immediately apologizes. When Cole tries uploading his videos to the internet, he experiences another hallucination and sees a text saying, "They hate you." After seeing his childhood picture on the screen, Cole grabs the keyboard and smashes it onto the table. During Bug's psych evaluation, Emily asks him about his guilt when he left his son, Sam. Bug says he was hoping to see Sam before he left. Emily suggests writing Sam a letter, but Bug does not like the idea of writing something that will never reach his son. With only 35 days left, Bug has become withdrawn from the crew, so Emily convinces him to leave his room. Bug is spending most of his time drawing a maze on the walls of his room. His isolation causes him to hallucinate about his son. Bug suddenly sees Sam crawling through a vent, so he follows him. When he reaches the other side, he sees Sam playing on the swing. Bug tells Sam that he made it to the final round of the astronaut selection process. When Sam asks Bug how long he'd be gone, he tells the boy that he'll be away for a long time. Sam suddenly disappears from the swing set, and Bug finds himself back in his room. On day 373, the crew suddenly hears a banging noise above them. The crew grows concerned as the banging continues, but Theo reminds them that the protocols instruct them to ignore it. That night, Cole wakes up hearing a noise outside his room. When he goes out to investigate, he comes across a hideous man in their kitchen. As Cole runs back to his room, he encounters Theo, so he directs him to the kitchen. As Theo investigates, Cole alerts the other crew about the intruder. The crew finds the man trying to escape through the vent, but he collapses, so they bring the man to the infirmary. When Emily asks how he got in, Cole notes that he went through an access panel on the science module. Bug asserts that something could be happening outside because of the man's poor condition. The crew panics when Bug suddenly collapses. Emily begins to feel drowsy, so she takes some pills before going to her room. While the crew sleeps, the computer indicates that the oxygen inside the ship has reached a critical level. Theo wakes up in the middle of the night as he runs out of breath, so he immediately knocks on the doors of the other crewmates to warn them about the oxygen level. Cole gets up, but Emily wouldn't come out of her room. After breaking down the door, Theo finds that Emily is not breathing. He performs CPR until Emily gasps for air and regains consciousness. Theo then runs to the infirmary to check on the intruder, but there's no one there. Moments later, Cole reveals that the air outside mixed with the air in the ship due to the breach caused by the intruder. Theo, however, points out that fresh air shouldn't have reduced their oxygen level. Emily warns the group that they could experience hallucination and memory loss as they lose oxygen. Theo suggests leaving the ship because Emily almost died, but Cole objects because he thinks it's still part of the simulation. Cole gets enraged when Theo insists on leaving, so Bug knocks him unconscious. Soon, Theo and Bug go outside through the vent and find a dark and dusty environment instead of green grass and lush trees. Before returning to the ship, Theo instructs Bug to take a sample of the dust to analyze it. When they tell the others what they found, Cole asserts that Mission Control must have moved the ship inside a giant dome. Not long, Bug reports that the dust samples contained armicolite, which is not supposed to exist on Earth. Theo instructs the crew to put on their spacesuits to investigate further. While walking outside, Cole contends that the experiment is still ongoing. He deduces that the shots they received were psychotropic drugs that opened their minds to suggestion and paranoia. After walking for an hour, the team reaches an empty house. Inside, Theo discovers a picture of the intruder and his family. Emily finds a map and notices that some places are crossed out, except for a town called Tranquility. The team decides to take the map to find the town and see if someone there can tell them what's happening. Upon reaching Tranquility, the astronauts take their helmets off and find that there's breathable air. Not long, they see a man outside a diner. Theo asks him what happened to civilization, but the man ignores the question and invites them inside the diner. When they get inside, the man, who introduces himself as Zell, offers them something to eat. Cole claims that the other people at the diner look familiar. He says that the other customers look like the reporters from the press conference, and the attractive woman behind them is Miss February from the magazines Walter gave to him. Zell sits with the crew and asks if they've encountered other survivors. As Theo keeps asking Zell about what happened, Zell realizes that they don't know anything. Zell then discloses that nobody knows exactly what happened. He recounts that a black object in the sky sent a cloud of dust under him and pulled him up. Zell deduces that they might be the only ones left in the world. Cole sees a hearing aid in Zell's ear and deduces that Walter is feeding Zell his lines. When Theo asks Zell how the town survived, Zell explains that they just got lucky. Zell tells them that they can stay the night, but they have to leave when they wake up. Cole decides to have a drink at the bar before going to sleep. Theo doesn't want the team to split up, so they all go with him. After a drink with the team, Cole leaves the table and starts flirting with the woman at the bar. Several patrons cover their view of Cole, so the astronauts don't notice that Cole and the woman have disappeared. The crew decides to wait for Cole to return. However, Cole fails to turn up after several hours, so they return to the diner to rest. Theo notes that someone should stay up and watch, so Bug volunteers to take the first shift. When Theo and Emily fall asleep, Bug enters the bathroom and hallucinates that he's in the hospital to visit Sam. When he asks the doctor about his son's condition, the doctor shakes his head. Bug screams when he realizes that Sam is dead. Upon leaving the bathroom, Bug comes across Sam in the hallway, but the boy suddenly runs away. Bug tries to run after him, but he runs into Zell. When Emily and Theo wake up, they ask Zell if they've seen Cole and Bug. However, Zell claims that Emily and Theo are the only ones who came into the diner. Zell asserts that they're seeing things because they're deprived of oxygen. When Theo begins looking for microphones inside the diner, Zell tells them to go back to the ship. Theo gets even more suspicious because they never told Zell that they were on a ship. Zell threatens them with a knife, so Emily urges Theo to leave the diner. A dust storm rages when they get outside, so they try to find another place to stay until it settles. However, the two get separated because it's too dark. Theo ends up in the diner's kitchen, where he finds a man in a small cage. The man begs him for help, so Theo unlocks the cage to release him. As Theo runs out of the kitchen, he accidentally gets stabbed in the stomach after bumping into a woman holding a knife. As he staggers outside, he comes across Emily, who is being followed by some of the town's strange residents. Emily and Theo run back to the bar to hide and tend to his wounds. The bartender soon returns and sees them, so they run back to their ship before he can alert the others. Soon they reach the house they saw earlier, so they stop by to continue stitching Theo's wound and rest. As Emily tries to sleep, Theo asks what Walter said to her before they entered the ship. Emily confesses that Walter reminded her of their deal to end their relationship. She reveals that Walter ordered her to break up with Theo because he wanted to find out if they could still fulfill their duties despite their breakup. Theo asserts they could have faked their breakup, but Emily thinks Walter would know because he's watching them closely. Theo contends that he would have told Emily if Walter had approached him. After some time, Emily wakes Theo up to return to the ship. Upon their arrival, they look for Bug and Cole, but they're nowhere to be found. When Theo closes the hatch, he sees 3 men nearby, so he immediately warns Emily. Theo takes a fire extinguisher and goes back outside. Soon, Zell and the chef from his diner enter the ship to look for them. Outside, Theo sprays the bartender with the fire extinguisher. The bartender fights back, but Theo manages to hit him in the head and knock him out. Theo runs back inside and comes across the chef. After a brief scuffle, Theo knocks him to the ground and strangles him to death. Theo then takes the chef's knife before searching for Zell. Zell eventually finds Emily, but Theo grabs him from behind. Zell breaks free from his grip by elbowing Theo. When Theo asks Zell what he did to Cole and Bug, Zell claims that they're still in town. Zell then puts his knife down on the table and urges Theo to do the same, so that they can go back to the town together. Theo complies with his request, but he suddenly pushes the table towards Zell and punches him in the face several times. Zell strikes back by slamming Theo's head on the table. After knocking Theo to the ground, Zell kicks him repeatedly. Zell then tries to stab Theo in the chest. As Theo struggles to block his knife, Emily arrives and stabs Zell in the back. Moments after Theo dies, the countdown indicating the completion of the experiment ends. Not long, Walter appears on the screen to congratulate them for completing the simulation. Theo and Emily look at each other in confusion, wondering if all they went through was part of the experiment. When Walter urges them to go outside, they hold hands, anticipating what they'll find. Theo takes a deep breath when he sees the light shining down inside the ship as the hatch opens.
This is all for Story Recap for today. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Tell us in the comments if you want us to recap your favorite movie. Watch other of our videos showing on the screen and leave a like because it helps the channel. And I would see you in the next video. Goodbye.